Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome back to Mingles with Jingles, once again sponsored by NordPass. Today's offer is date dependent. Until the 10th of March you can get 70% off a 2-year NordPass premium plan with the traditional extra month thrown in for free. As always, it's completely risk-free with NordPass's 30-day money-back guarantee. Get over to nordpass.com/jingles and use code JINGLES to get this deal, and keep those passwords safe and organised. I really do genuinely recommend NordPass. I've been using it for months and I don't regret it for a second. As well as all of the password manager features, such as the ability to generate secure passwords that are completely unguessable, and which are all encrypted at your end, so that even if Nord were to get breached, nobody would be able to get their hands on your passwords. It also comes with a data breach scanner to find out if your online account or credit card information has been leaked anywhere on the web. Checks your password health across all of your accounts to determine whether or not the passwords are weak, have been in use for 90 days or more, or are duplicated across multiple different accounts and websites, and offers you simple one-click options to fix all of those problems with new, secure passwords. So if you're as lazy as I am, and you just can't be bothered with the hassle of managing multiple different passwords across multiple different websites and accounts, then just do what I do and let Nord take care of it for you. Until the 10th of March, you can head on over to nordpass.com/jingles and use code JINGLES to get 70% off a 2-year premium plan plus 1 month for free. And if you don't like it, you can get your money back with a 30-day guarantee. And so, on with the show. It's been a pretty eventful week. I mean, not for me. For me, it's been as dull as dishwater. I mean, you know, for the world. Before we get on to that, though, can I just say thank you? You guys are absolutely awesome. Well, most of you are. Almost all of you are, but there's always going to be a couple of arseholes. I'm talking about the fundraiser for medical supplies for Ukrainian refugees. When I put this fundraiser up, it had a limit of $5,000, which got smashed. Was raised to $10,000, which got smashed. Was raised to $20,000, which got smashed. It's currently sitting at $46,417. We've had to raise the total to $50,000 in order to keep up with your amazing donations. So before anybody else hears me say anything that upsets them, can I just say thank you so much for that. I mean, everybody goes on about how everybody on the internet's an utter arsehole, and it's usually true. But in this case, you guys have been amazing. So regardless of whatever else anybody thinks about the situation in, and I have to say, Ukraine, not the Ukraine, I'm really sorry about that, but old habits die hard. Regardless of what anybody else thinks about the situation, can we all just agree that some genuine good is being done, and it's thanks to you. Even though I'm saying this in the full knowledge that there's going to be somebody who doesn't agree. There's going to be somebody out there who's going to find some way of taking offence to the fact that between us, we've raised nearly $50,000 to try to ensure that homeless Ukrainian families don't freeze or starve to death. And I guarantee that somebody in the comments section of this video is going to try to present that as a bad thing. And it usually comes in the form of a particular fallacious argument that's known as a whataboutism. Oh, you're raising money for Ukrainian refugees. What about the Palestinians? What about the Syrians? The logic of the argument seems to be, although there isn't any logic to the argument, that's why it's called a logical fallacy, is that if you're donating to help people in the Ukraine, then that makes you completely incapable of being able to do anything to help anybody anywhere else. It's a logical fallacy. It's defined as an argument which attempts to discredit an opponent's position by accusing them of hypocrisy without directly refuting or disproving the argument in the first place. It's a depressingly common argument tactic found on the internet, in particular in YouTube video comment sections, along with things like the ad hominem fallacy, which is where somebody makes a statement, and rather than confronting the facts of the statement, you simply attack the person who made the statement. It's all very depressing, and I suppose I was being way too optimistic in thinking that there wouldn't be any of it in a fundraiser to help refugees, but, well, you know, welcome to the 21st century. On the bright side, I can at least console myself with the undeniable fact that we've still managed to raise nearly $50,000 for Ukrainian refugees. And honestly, that's all that matters. Thank you. Now then, moving on swiftly. Well, not exactly moving on. We are still going to be talking about the events in Ukraine. But what I'm not going to be doing is jumping onto my high horse and trotting out what I suspect many of you probably expect me to be saying. You know, Russia bad, NATO good, because it's never as simple as that. I mean, NATO member states have been guilty of some really dubious shit over the last 20, 30 years. For example, the war in Iraq, the second war in Iraq, the one that I wasn't personally involved in, where my Prime Minister at the time, good old Tony Blair, basically made up a whopping great big pack of lies, disguised as intelligence, about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction, none of which have ever been found to this day, in order to justify George W. Bush whipping up a coalition to go in there and finish the job his daddy started in the first Gulf War, the one that I was personally involved in, toppling Saddam Hussein's regime in order to get justice for the victims of 9/11, something that Saddam Hussein and Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with, and in the process, funnily enough, carving the country up for Halliburton. These are exactly the same tactics that Vladimir Putin is currently being lambasted for, make a whole bunch of shit up in order to justify invading Ukraine again. And this is another one of these whataboutisms that you see in any discussion of the situation in Ukraine. Oh, you're accusing Vladimir Putin of this, but what about the coalition that invaded Iraq in 2003? Well, what about it? I hope we can at least all agree that Saddam Hussein was a monstrous shithead who absolutely should have been removed from power. And yet the process by which that happened was what, by any standard that you care to measure it, was an illegal war justified by a monstrous pack of lies posing as valid intelligence. Iraq never had weapons of mass destruction, and they had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. But while you could probably be quite justified in saying that the West behaved like a complete bunch of arseholes in the way in which they got the coalition together to go in there and remove Saddam Hussein from power, but pointing to that, or anything else suspect that a NATO member state has been guilty of doing in the last 20 to 30 years, as if it somehow absolves Russia of any kind of wrongdoing for doing exactly the same thing in Ukraine, is a logical fallacy. It is entirely possible for both sides to be arseholes. The world is not black and white. Bad people often do good things, and good people often do bad things. Oh well, but if the West did it in 2003 in Iraq, then it must be alright for Putin to do it in 2022 in Ukraine. No, it isn't. I used to have arguments like this in the playground at school when I was 5. Grow up. Oh, there I was saying I wasn't going to get on my high horse. 8 minutes later, I finally climbed down off the high horse. And I am going to climb down off the high horse now. I mean, I'm not going to be able to change people's opinions with, simple things like facts and logic. But I am going to stick to facts and logic throughout the rest of this video. Because, and I have to thank a number of you, by the way, who since last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles have suggested that I go and look at a video about the whole Ukraine situation by a YouTube channel that goes by the name Real Life Law. It was a 25-minute long video. I'm not going to repeat everything that he said there. If you're interested and you want to know more, I'll put a link in the description. It is an excellent video, and after watching it and also reading a couple of articles online, in particular one from the Royal United Services Institute, it's answered a couple of lingering questions about things that just still didn't make a whole lot of sense to me about the invasion of Ukraine. So from here on in, we're going to be sticking to the facts. We're not going to be rendering judgment or giving opinions. We're just going to be looking at the facts. Or at least the facts that can actually be verified as facts, because, well, there's a whole lot of disinformation going on being conducted by both sides. And it can be very difficult to determine what is an actual fact. However, having said that, in the comments section of last week's episode of Mingles, a number of you pointed out a couple of things that just didn't seem to make any kind of sense whatsoever from a Russian security standpoint, and that, when you looked at them, did seem more than a little ironic. So, Russia, concerned about its security, doesn't like all of these countries on its borders switching allegiance to NATO, felt threatened by the blue tide, if you like, getting closer and closer to Russia's borders. Now, the reason that these countries are signing up to the NATO Charter is because they're afraid of being invaded by Russia. And so, of course, Russia's response to this is to go ahead and invade all of its neighbours. It seems more than a little like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's what? Item number one. The second item, closely related, is that if Russia is so concerned about NATO countries on its borders, by invading and occupying the Ukraine, all it's actually doing is moving its borders closer to NATO. Again, doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense. It's as if in trying to do something to avoid a situation that it doesn't want, Russia does something that creates the situation that it doesn't want. It's just, what? And yet it does actually make quite a bit of sense, particularly if you're in the Kremlin. And you don't actually have to be that paranoid to understand it when you look at it geographically. See, Russia is a very, very big country. And we're only talking about European Russia here, up to the Ural Mountains. I mean, it's even bigger in Asian Russia, but we'll concern ourselves with European Russia. So anything west of the Urals. It's still a very, very big country. And it's a very, very wide country. But it gets progressively more narrow the further west you go. So at the moment, the border that Russia shares with NATO member states in its current position is around about 1,200 kilometres long. And it's not just the length of the border, which is a lot of territory to defend. It's also the nature of the terrain, because it's slap bang in the middle of the Central European plain. Or to put it another way, the perfect kind of land to roll tanks, ammunition and fuel supply trucks along. A point that was largely lost on Russia in 1941, but it wasn't lost on Germany. If you were able to move that border further west, even by a couple of hundred kilometres, not only would the border be substantially shorter, but parts of it would only have to be relatively lightly defended, because the nature of the terrain would make it extremely difficult to move mechanised units through it. Now you may, quite rightly, be thinking that this only makes sense if you're a paranoid Russian, because NATO's never going to invade Russia. Well, is it? Well, probably not, no. Certainly not in our lifetimes. Even during the height of the Cold War, NATO's strategy in Europe was defensive. They had plans to invade Russia, but that doesn't mean that they planned to invade Russia. It makes sense to have a plan for every eventuality, regardless of how realistic you may or may not think that eventuality is. Because if it happens and you don't have a plan, you're in the shit. Look at Japan in World War II. Their plan was to take over the Eastern Pacific and knock America out of the war early. What were they going to do if that didn't work? Well, they didn't have a plan B. So they were in the shit. Simply having a plan doesn't mean that you intend to follow it through. Before World War II broke out, America had a plan for what to do if Britain turned hostile. That didn't mean they expected Britain to turn hostile, but it was a good idea to have a plan just in case, because, well, for a while it was looking possible that Britain could have been invaded, and even if that hadn't been the case, and thankfully it wasn't, who knows what the political situation is going to be like 20 years down the line. It's best to have a plan and not need it than to need a plan and not have it. So Russia definitely has a plan for narrowing that NATO border by expanding it further west. The problem for the rest of the world is that it is no longer theoretical. They're actually doing it right now, by gobbling up all of those neighbours that have not yet signed up for NATO before they sign up for NATO, at which point it's too late and too risky. I also suspect, and this is just speculation, but I suspect that Russia thought that they would just be able to get away with it again, the same way that they did in 2008 when they rolled into Georgia, and 2014 the first time they rolled into Ukraine. Because at the time, Western nations were kind of occupied in Iraq and Afghanistan and couldn't really afford to give too much attention to Ukraine and Georgia. Although it would have been a little hypocritical at the time, although that's never stopped Western governments before. If the West had kicked up a fuss about Russia doing exactly the same thing in Ukraine and Georgia that the West was busy doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's likely, in my opinion anyway, that Russia thought, well, they didn't kick up a fuss when we invaded Georgia, they didn't kick up a fuss the first time we invaded Ukraine, they're probably not going to kick up a fuss this time. Unfortunately for Russia, they severely underestimated how the West was going to respond to this. However, what I want you to try to bear in mind here, regardless of how ridiculous it may sound to you, from a certain paranoid Russian military point of view, it can be said that what Russia is currently doing in Ukraine can be seen as defensive in nature, in that if they manage to occupy the Ukraine and move their border with NATO further west, they're shortening the line of territory that needs to be defended in the event that NATO turns hostile. Yes, I know, what they're doing is very likely to make NATO turn hostile. I know I've never said it made a huge amount of sense, but from a paranoid Russian military point of view, this can be viewed as a defensive action. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying try to put yourself in the headspace of somebody in the Kremlin at the moment. Think about it from that point of view. And then we'll move on to point number 2. And point number 2 is also military, but it's also economic. Trust me, it's not boring. I know people's eyes tend to glaze over when you say the word economic, but bear with me, alright? So, back in 2014, when Russia invaded and occupied the Crimea, I think most people, myself included, saw it as a purely military move, because it got them access to Sevastopol, which is one of the very few warm water ports available to the Russian Navy. I think the only other warm water port of consequence that they have is Vladivostok, and that is in the Pacific. So great, they've got Sevastopol. That gives the Russian Navy a warm water port on the Black Sea. But the Black Sea doesn't go anywhere. If they want to get to the Mediterranean, they have to go through the Bosphorus Straits, and Turkey controls that, and Turkey is a NATO member state and can shut it off anytime they want. So what exactly did Russia gain by occupying the Crimea? Other than pissing off the West, and Ukraine obviously, and making Turkey extremely nervous. Well, occupying the Crimea was not done for military reasons. Getting access to Sevastopol was a nice bonus prize, obviously. I'm sure the Russian Navy isn't complaining, but it was done for economic reasons. You see, at the moment, Russia is Europe's only petrostate, i.e. an exporter of oil and natural gas. And you'll never guess what was discovered in huge quantities, not just in the Ukrainian mainland itself, but off the coast of the Crimea. You guessed it. Oil and gas. It always seems to come down to oil and gas, doesn't it? Well, if you're Russia, you're damn right it does. It's the country's #1 export and is responsible for most of the country's GDP. Just look at Germany, for example. 40% of all of Germany's natural gas is imported from Russia. Now here's the thing. When the Soviet Union fell over and all of the Soviet Socialist republics got their independence, and a number of them started signing up to NATO as quickly as they could before it was too late, the main pipeline that transported all of that oil and natural gas from Russia to the West went right through the middle of Ukraine and was suddenly now Ukrainian property. And Ukraine started charging Russia money for the use of the pipeline. A lot of money. Russia, quite understandably, not wanting to be held ransom over their country's most valuable export via a nation that was very likely going to become a potentially hostile alliance member state in the near future, rather than simply invading Ukraine, spent billions building alternate pipelines that got around this problem. So, no need for a hasty war, everything's good, yeah? Yeah, until huge reserves of oil and gas were found, not just on the Ukrainian mainland, but also off the coast of the Crimea. So now Russia potentially has a big problem, because if Ukraine can exploit these oil and gas reserves, which are substantial, and become Europe's second petrostate, they could potentially undercut Russia. And, well, who do you think the West would rather deal with? This would have disastrous effects I mean, catastrophic effects on the Russian economy. But there's a faint glimmer of hope here for Russia, because Ukraine is dirt poor and didn't even remotely have the money, especially since they weren't earning that fat Russian oil pipeline tariff dollar anymore, didn't remotely have the money to be able to build the infrastructure required to exploit these natural resources. But Western oil companies did, companies like BP and Exxon. So Ukraine signed contracts with them to build the infrastructure to extract the oil and gas and cut the Ukrainian government in for a healthy share of the profits. And Russia simply could not let that happen. It would have been an economic disaster on a scale that is hard to fathom. Now, one potential solution to this problem may have been to say, hey, Ukraine, I see you've got a lot of natural oil and gas there and you don't have the money to extract it. Let us stump up the investment money and we'll share the profits with you. But the Kremlin doesn't think like that. So in 2014, Russia made up a pack of lies about protecting ethnic Russian interests, rolled in the tanks, conquered and occupied the Crimea, gaining themselves access to a very, very useful warm water port at Sevastopol, but more importantly, denying Ukraine the opportunity of ever being able to exploit those natural oil and gas fields. Not just because they geographically cut them off from the ones in the Caspian Sea, but also they'd scared off all of those Western oil companies. Now, again, bear with me. Just wait, give me a chance. I'm not saying this is right. I'm saying that if you view this from a paranoid Russian perspective, this too can be seen as a defensive action. However, there's some bad news for Russia here, because they failed to take into account a couple of things when they invaded and occupied the Crimea. Well, one main thing. Actually, yeah, two. Their only actual access to the Crimea is via sea. They didn't invade and occupy the strip of land that connects the Crimea to mainland Russia. They also forgot that the Crimea gets 85% of its water from Ukraine. And Ukraine turned the taps off. They dammed the river that supplies Crimea with almost all of its fresh water. Russian-occupied Crimea is dying a slow death, and basically has been since 2014 when Russia invaded and occupied it. They're on water rationing, and things aren't looking good. Now fast forward to 2022. Russia has invaded Ukraine again, for the second time in 8 years. And while it may look, and again, I do have to caution you about where you get your news from, or what you trust as actual news rather than disinformation or propaganda, but we can probably all agree that the invasion hasn't really been going according to plan. The surprisingly inept performance of the Russian military, in particular their air force, I mean, I'm pretty sure, and we could have an entire other half-hour long video discussing this topic, but I'm pretty sure everybody assumed that the Russians would have achieved air supremacy on day one, and that clearly hasn't happened. I mean, we've got situations where Russian armoured columns are piled up in traffic jams, perfect targets for airstrikes, and the air defence vehicles in the columns don't even have their radar turned on, and are getting taken out by drone strikes. A quick invasion and occupation that was supposed to take 3 days is now dragging on into its second week, and I mean, you can't blame it all on the ineptitude of the Russian military, of course. I mean, you have to give credit to the Ukrainian military, but at the same time, on the face of things ain't looking good for Russia. But I would argue that Vladimir Putin has already achieved everything that he needs to achieve with the invasion of Ukraine. He hasn't achieved everything that he wanted to achieve. I'm pretty sure he would have liked to have already occupied the entire country and pushed that border further west, narrowing the amount of territory that Russia may have to defend in the future against NATO. But as far as everything that he absolutely definitely needed to do, he's pretty much already done it. Because if you look at the territory that Russia has actually captured, which falls far short of what everybody expected them to have captured, but what they have actually captured, and you look at the timing of when Russia agreed to sit down to negotiations, that agreement did not happen until Russia had secured a corridor of land extending west from the Russian mainland and linking up with the Crimea Yeah. And then pushed north from the Crimea, securing a source of fresh water. And it was only at that point that Russia said, yeah, we'll sit down to negotiations. And I will eat my own arse if Russia agrees to give up any of that territory. Economically and militarily, Russia simply cannot afford to give that territory back. I'm pretty sure, and again, I'm no geopolitical expert, but based on what I know of the situation, that if Russia is going to make concessions, none of that territory is going to be part of it. They could capture Kiev tomorrow and agree to give it back at the negotiating table, but the Crimean Peninsula, the land bridge connecting the Crimean Peninsula to mainland Russia, and all of the territory north of the Crimea that secures the Crimea's water supply is going to be a red line bargaining counter. Russia will not give that up. And it will have to be taken from them militarily. And the Ukrainian military is sadly just not up to the task. If it's going to be taken back off them, NATO's going to have to do it. And God help us all if it comes to that. And on that reassuring note, that's it for today. I won't say I hope you enjoyed it, but I hope it's given you something to think about, and of course, something to talk about in the comments. In the meantime, as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.